For the first time in his presidency, Donald Trump is not fighting Democrats. He's fighting his own party. And I'm not talking about whispers in hallways or anonymous quotes to reporters. I'm talking about Republican senators standing up, casting votes against him, and drawing a constitutional line in the sand. What triggered this? Three things colliding at once: military threats against a NATO ally, an emergency declaration over foreign oil, and an accountability crisis that nobody in Washington wants to explain. Trump's response has been exactly what you'd expect: profanity, threats, and demands for absolute loyalty. But here's what's different this time. It's not working. So today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened, why it matters, and what everyone is missing about where this leads. Because this isn't just political drama. This is a stress test of whether American power answers to law or to one man's instincts. Let's get into it. Let me start with the facts, clean and simple. Last week, Republican senators joined with Democrats to advance something called a War Powers Resolution. Now, that's a technical term, so let me explain what it actually does. It's a legislative tool designed to limit the president's ability to use military force without Congress approving it first. This vote wasn't symbolic, it wasn't close. It was a direct message from lawmakers to the White House: you don't get to start wars alone. And the reason this vote happened is because Trump has been openly, publicly, repeatedly suggesting military action against Greenland. Not as a joke, not as negotiation theater, as a real option he's considering. Now, here's where most people miss the significance. Greenland isn't some unclaimed territory sitting in the Arctic. Greenland belongs to Denmark. Denmark is a founding member of NATO. And NATO operates on a principle called collective defense, meaning an attack on one member is treated as an attack on all members. So when an American president starts floating military options against allied territory, it's not just unusual. It's constitutionally and internationally explosive. Senator Susan Collins was reportedly on the receiving end of one of Trump's phone calls after she voted for this resolution. The language, according to sources, was harsh. The message was unmistakable: loyalty or consequences. But she didn't back down. And neither did other Republicans who crossed the line. Now, while all of this is unfolding, something else happened that got far less attention. Trump declared a national emergency over Venezuelan oil assets, invoking extraordinary executive powers to centralize control and bypass congressional debate entirely. And at the same time, senators like Sheldon Whitehouse are publicly asking why promised document disclosures haven't materialized, why Inspector General reviews have stalled, and why transparency commitments keep slipping. Three fronts, three crises, and Republicans caught in the middle. That's what's happening. Now let me show you why it's happening. To understand why Republicans are suddenly willing to break with Trump, you have to understand what the War Powers Act actually is and why it exists. This isn't some obscure procedural rule. The War Powers Act was passed in 1973, after decades of presidents dragging America into conflicts without congressional approval. Vietnam was the breaking point. Lawmakers watched an entire generation sent to war based on executive decisions that bypassed democratic debate. So Congress said, never again. The law requires presidents to consult Congress before committing military forces and limits how long troops can remain deployed without legislative authorization. It's a constitutional safeguard, not a partisan weapon. So when Trump started publicly discussing military options for Greenland, lawmakers didn't hear foreign policy strategy. They heard alarm bells. Because Greenland isn't just Danish territory in name. It's home to Thule Air Base, one of the most critical installations in America's missile defense network. It's a strategic asset we've maintained through cooperation and alliance, not conquest. Any military threat against that territory doesn't just violate international law. It shatters NATO credibility overnight. And here's the number that should keep you up at night. NATO's Article 5, the Collective Defense Clause, has been invoked exactly once in the alliance's 75-year history, after September 11th, when Europe stood with America, If the United States were ever perceived as threatening a NATO member, that unity collapses. European defense cooperation deteriorates. Intelligence sharing, which depends entirely on trust, gets jeopardized. And who benefits? Russia, China, Iran. They would seize that propaganda victory before the ink dried on the headlines. But here's what I think is really driving this moment. Trump doesn't process foreign policy through alliances and treaties. He processes it like real estate territory, leverage, dominance. And that mindset, applied to military power, is precisely what terrifies his own party. Because once a president frames force as an option, the machinery starts moving, contingency plans get drafted, allies start hedging, and Congress either reasserts itself or becomes irrelevant. The war powers resolution wasn't theater. It was an emergency break. And Trump's reaction, the rage, the profanity, the personal threats, proves exactly why that break was necessary. Because leaders who view constitutional limits as personal betrayals are precisely the leaders who need those limits enforced. But here's where this gets even more complicated. While the war powers fight dominated headlines, something else slipped through with far less scrutiny. Trump's national emergency declaration over Venezuelan oil. Now, on paper, this sounds reasonable. Secure energy assets, reduce dependence on hostile regimes, protect American interests. But look closer. Venezuela's oil infrastructure has been in ruins for years. Decades of mismanagement, sanctions, and underinvestment have gutted it. Rebuilding would take 10 years minimum and tens of billions in capital. And here's the question nobody's asking loudly enough. Who actually benefits from this? Not American consumers. The primary winners would be multinational energy corporations with the capital and expertise to extract and refine Venezuela's heavy crude. We're talking about companies that operate globally, whose profits don't necessarily flow back to American workers or families. But here's what really caught my attention: the timing. This emergency wasn't declared during an acute crisis. It was declared during a political firestorm over war powers and oversight, when Trump desperately needed to change the subject and consolidate authority. And emergencies do something very powerful. They centralize decision-making. They bypass legislative processes. They allow presidents to act unilaterally. Trump has leaned on emergency powers repeatedly: border wall funding, COVID responses, trade restrictions, and now this. And each time, the threshold for what qualifies as an emergency gets lower. Each time, the scope of presidential action gets wider. Republicans are finally noticing the pattern. Because here's the trap nobody wants to acknowledge. Today's emergency precedent becomes tomorrow's normal. Once you normalize unilateral executive power, it doesn't vanish when your party loses the White House. It gets inherited by whoever comes next. Every Republican voting to expand these powers should ask themselves, do I want a future Democratic president wielding this same authority? Because that's exactly what they're building. Now layer in the accountability failures. Trump campaigned explicitly on transparency, particularly regarding classified documents he promised to release. He framed it as a signature issue, suggested personal involvement, and set expectations high. But months into his term, the results don't match the rhetoric. Timelines have slipped, reviews have stretched, and lawmakers like Senator Whitehouse are now publicly asking why. He cited Inspector General compliance concerns, statutory deadlines being missed, commitments that haven't translated into action. He's not alleging conspiracy. He's identifying process failure. And process failures matter because they reveal whether promises were genuine or purely performative. Here's where I connect the dots. Every time oversight pressure increases, Trump escalates the external drama. War threats get louder, emergency declarations multiply, the news cycle floods with new controversies. And the underlying accountability questions get buried under spectacle. This isn't accidental. It's strategy. The same strategy Trump has used for decades: flood the zone, exhaust the opposition, and make it impossible for anyone to focus on one issue long enough to hold you accountable. But Congress isn't an audience that gets bored and moves on. It's a co-equal branch of government with subpoena power, budget authority, and institutional memory. Some Republicans are remembering that they have power too, not just to support the president, but to check him. And that realization is what's driving this revolt. Not ideology, not partisan gain. Cold recognition that if they don't defend institutional limits now, those limits won't exist later. I know this can feel abstract: constitutional theory, war powers, emergency declarations. So let me bring it down to earth. Who actually gets hurt when power concentrates and institutions weaken? Start with American families. Right now, people across this country are watching their president threaten military action against allies, while inflation remains stubbornly high and grocery bills haven't dropped. Remember the core promise that attracted millions of voters: economic security and no new wars. That promise is colliding with rhetoric that increasingly sounds like war planning. And voters don't separate foreign policy from kitchen table economics. They understand instability abroad threatens stability at home. If markets panic over NATO fracturing, retirement accounts take the hit. If emergency powers bypass Congress repeatedly, voters lose their voice in how American power gets used. Think about a middle-class family in Pennsylvania. They voted hoping for lower costs and restrained foreign policy. Now they're reading about Greenland invasions and Venezuelan oil emergencies, while their wages haven't risen and their bills haven't dropped. That cognitive dissonance is real, and it's fueling disillusionment even among the base. Now consider small business owners. They depend on stability, predictable trade relationships, reliable supply chains, consistent policy. When the American president threatens military action against allied territory, uncertainty spikes. You can't plan investments when you don't know if NATO will fracture. You can't make 5-year projections when emergency declarations can reshape entire sectors overnight without legislative debate. Imagine a small manufacturing firm in Ohio that exports to Europe. If NATO credibility collapses, European partners start hedging. They diversify supply chains away from American vendors, not immediately, but gradually. The damage isn't a single headline. It's a slow erosion of trust that costs contracts, jobs, and revenue over months and years. Large corporations face different calculations. Energy companies might see opportunity in Venezuelan assets, but only if infrastructure investments pencil out over decades, and only if political stability holds long enough to profit. Defense contractors watch NATO tensions nervously because alliance fractures threaten the collective security architecture that drives procurement budgets. Financial institutions see emergency power precedents and worry about rule of law predictability, which is foundational to every investment decision they make. When governance risk increases, capital costs rise. Those costs get passed to consumers. Stock markets have already shown sensitivity to erratic announcements. Volatility follows war rhetoric. Institutional investors price in uncertainty. And that uncertainty premium lands on ordinary Americans. Internationally, the recalibration is already happening. European defense ministers are privately discussing what NATO actually means if the United States threatens a member state. Canadian officials are watching Greenland rhetoric and reassessing Arctic security cooperation. Asian allies are asking whether American commitments remain reliable if Atlantic alliances fray. And adversaries are taking notes. Russia has already amplified Trump's Greenland comments in state media, framing them as proof of American imperialism and NATO hypocrisy. China is watching for opportunities to expand influence in Europe if American alliances weaken. Iran sees emergency power escalation and calculates that Trump might overreach into conflicts he can't control. But here's the ripple effect that deserves more attention: institutional trust. When Congress has to invoke war powers acts against its own president, when emergency declarations become routine, when oversight consistently fails to produce transparency, public faith in governance erodes. And that erosion isn't partisan. Liberals distrust executive overreach. Conservatives distrust unaccountable power. And everyone in the middle just sees chaos. Constitutional scholars are calling this moment a stress test of checks and balances. Former national security officials are expressing alarm at how casually military threats get deployed. Economists warn that policy unpredictability is a hidden tax on growth costs that don't show up in headlines but accumulate in slower investment, reduced hiring, and diminished opportunity. These consequences aren't hypothetical. They're unfolding right now. So where does this go from here? I won't pretend to predict exact outcomes. That's not analysis, that's guessing. But I can outline the pressures and possibilities. In the next 30 to 90 days, this Republican resistance will likely intensify. The War Powers Resolution vote was procedural, but it signaled something deeper, a willingness to check executive authority that we haven't seen since Trump returned to office. More oversight requests are coming on emergency declarations, on document disclosures, on Inspector General findings. Trump will almost certainly escalate rhetoric. He'll frame dissent as sabotage and double down on loyalty tests. But here's the thing about crossing lines. Once you've done it, crossing back becomes harder. Republicans who voted against him have already accepted the political risk, they've already taken the call, they've already faced the threats. At that point, backing down offers no protection, only weakness. Markets will remain volatile as long as policy unpredictability persists. NATO will quietly begin contingency planning for scenarios where American commitments prove less reliable, and voters will continue processing whether the presidency they're watching matches the presidency they were promised. The 6 to 12-month horizon is where the real test arrives. Can institutions hold? Can Congress maintain oversight discipline when new crises emerge weekly? Can courts adjudicate emergency power challenges without becoming partisan battlegrounds? Can voters distinguish between spectacle and governance when both arrive at maximum volume? If Republican resistance holds, we could see a genuine rebalancing, executive power checked, congressional authority reasserted, norms reinforced. If it collapses under sustained pressure, we're watching a presidency that operates beyond institutional limits, setting precedents that will shape American governance for decades. And internationally, some damage may already be permanent. Allied trust, once broken, takes years to rebuild. Adversaries who see weakness in American alliances will exploit it immediately. This isn't a partisan prediction. It's a structural reality. Power unchecked doesn't correct itself. It requires resistance. And right now, that resistance is being tested in real time. Here's what you need to take away from everything we just covered. First, Republicans are pushing back against Trump not out of disloyalty, but out of alarm. War powers, emergency declarations, and accountability failures are colliding simultaneously, forcing lawmakers to choose between party loyalty and institutional survival. Second, the fight over military threats against Greenland isn't symbolic. It's a constitutional crisis over whether presidents can threaten NATO allies without consequence and whether Congress will defend its authority or surrender it. Third, process matters. When disclosures stall, when oversight fails, and when emergencies become routine, democracy doesn't collapse in one dramatic moment. It erodes gradually until someone finally says no. The question in front of all of us isn't whether Trump wins the next news cycle. It's whether the rules that govern power remain stronger than the people who hold it. So here's what I want to know from you. When institutions get tested like this, what matters more, spectacle or stability? Do you think Republicans will hold the line or fold under pressure? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read them. They shape how I approach these stories. If this breakdown helped you understand what's actually happening beyond the headlines, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because this story isn't over, it's just getting started. And remember something important. Democracy doesn't protect itself. It relies on people, lawmakers, judges, voters, citizens willing to defend it when it's inconvenient, uncomfortable, and politically risky. That defense is happening right now. Whether it succeeds depends on whether enough people are paying attention. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.